Imagine one of Chicago's most powerful mafia bosses, a man whose name alone makes grown men tremble, sitting alone in the darkest corner of an upscale bar, sipping whiskey like he does every night, completely unaware that this evening would bring him the strangest request of his entire life. Thorne Valencia was 37 years old, tall with cold gray eyes and a faint scar running down his left cheek. A man who'd built his empire through blood and betrayal, who'd learned the hard way that money buys loyalty but never truth. He came to the Obsidian Room every night, not as the boss everyone feared, but as a ghost, seeking silence, dressed simply in black. No flashy watches, no bodyguards, just a man tired of being surrounded by lies and outstretched hands. He'd been watching the old cleaning lady work for months, noticed how she moved quietly through the shadows, honest and hardworking, never asking anyone for anything. But tonight, that same woman would kneel before him with tears streaming down her weathered face, and whisper a desperate plea that would leave him speechless. "Please, sir, I'm begging you. Pretend to be my daughter's boyfriend for just one night. Save her from the man who wants to destroy her." What seemed like an absurd request from a stranger would become the beginning of a love story no one expected, least of all the man who'd forgotten what it felt like to care about anyone but himself. Stay until the end to discover how a mother's desperate courage transformed 3 broken lives forever. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good tale, and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to how it all began. On that fateful night when darkness first met its light, the Obsidian Room sat on the top floor of an old, dignified building in the heart of the Gold Coast, where Chicago's wealthiest lived and spent money as if tomorrow would never come. From the outside, the bar looked like an exclusive club for the elite, the kind of place ordinary people wouldn't even dare to step into, afraid of the contempt in the eyes of guests wearing expensive suits. But inside, the Obsidian Room was an entirely different world, a world of darkness and secrets, where million-dollar deals were sealed with a nod, where the most powerful figures in the city came to slip away from the public's light. The interior was designed in nothing but dark tones, black velvet chairs as ink black as night, walnut tables polished until they could hold a reflection like a mirror, low-hanging dim gold lights casting interwoven bands of shadow and glow that made every face look mysterious and hard to read. The scent of premium whiskey mixed with a faint trace of sandalwood in the air, creating an atmosphere that was both luxurious and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were guarding countless secrets that would never be spoken aloud. The VIP area lay in the deepest corner of the bar, separated from the rest by a heavy velvet curtain and 2 steps of black marble. It was Thorne's territory, the place where he sat alone every night from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock, never earlier, never later, like a religious ritual he had set for himself. He always ordered exactly 2 glasses of whiskey neat, no ice, no water, sipping slowly while his cold gray eyes watched everything around him without missing a single detail. The staff here had grown used to his presence. They knew not to disturb him unless he signaled. They knew to bring his drinks at the right time and leave in silence. To them, he was only a mysterious guest with money, a gentleman who preferred solitude over pointless conversation. No one knew he was the true owner of this place, that every dollar of profit flowed into his account, that the Obsidian Room was only one of dozens of legitimate businesses he used to wash clean the blood-stained money from his underworld empire. Only Frank Morrison, the 62-year-old manager, with snow-white hair and eyes sharp as a blade, knew the truth. Frank had served the Valencia family since before Thorne was even born. He had watched him grow from an innocent boy into a cold-blooded kingpin, and he was the only person in this world Thorne trusted enough to hand the keys to this small kingdom. Thorne came here every night not for the whiskey, though he liked the burn of it sliding down his throat. He came because this was the only place he could take off the mask of power, the only place where he didn't have to be Thorne Valencia, the man all of Chicago feared, not the boss who controlled a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, not the man who had ordered killings without a tremor in his hand. Here, in this dark corner, he was only a man worn down by loneliness, a lost soul drifting through a world he had built with his own hands but had never truly belonged to. Outside these walls, everyone wanted something from him. Money, power, protection, or simply the chance to stand beneath his shadow and catch whatever scraps of glory still spilled from it. They smiled at him with false smiles, spoke sweet words he knew were lies, reached out with friendly hands, while the other hand hid a knife behind their back, waiting for the moment to strike. He had seen too much, lost too much, been betrayed too many times to trust anyone anymore. Money could buy loyalty, and he knew that better than anyone because he'd used money to build his army. But money never bought truth. It never bought a sincere heart that looked at him for who he was, instead of what he owned. And maybe, deep down at the very bottom of his soul, Thorn had given up hope of finding that a long time ago. Thorn took a sip of whiskey, the familiar burn sliding down his throat, but it couldn't chase away the cold that had frozen inside his chest for nearly 20 years. Whenever he sat alone in this dark corner, the memories would surge back like unstoppable waves, dragging him to the fateful night that changed everything. He was 18 when he watched his father get shot dead right in front of him, in the very office he'd once believed was the safest place in the world. Anthony Valencia, the man Thorn worshipped like a god, collapsed to the floor with 3 bullets tearing through his chest, blood spreading into a dark pool beneath the dim yellow light. The one who pulled the trigger was his father's business partner of 20 years, a man who had once sat at their table every Sunday dinner, who had carried Thorn in his arms when he was small, who had sworn loyalty until his final breath. But greed and power turned that oath to ash, turned a friend into a traitor, turned a carefree teenager into an orphaned child trembling beside his father's body, while the stench of gunpowder still hung thick in the air. Thorn still remembered his father's eyes in those last seconds. Not fear, not pain, but a silent message. Survive, be strong, take it all back. And he did exactly that. At 18, Thorn took over his father's empire with violence and blood, with sleepless nights spent plotting revenge, with the bullets he fired with his own hand into the head of the man who'd murdered his father. He learned how to kill before he learned how to love. He learned how to trust no one before he learned how to open his heart. He learned how to build a wall around himself out of steel and ice. The early years were chaos, territory wars, ambushes, negotiations conducted with guns, but Thorn survived and grew, turning the Valencia family from a weakening organization into the most powerful empire in Chicago. Then Catherine appeared, 5 years after his father's death, when Thorn was 23, and his name had already become one that the entire underworld feared. She was beautiful like a dream, hair as golden as wheat in sunlight, eyes as clear and blue as an autumn lake, and a smile that could melt even his frozen heart. For the first time in 5 years, Thorn felt truly alive instead of merely existing. For the first time, he imagined a future with someone else. For the first time, he lowered his wall and let someone step into the forbidden ground he guarded with his life. He loved Catherine with everything he had, with the fierce intensity of a man who'd never known love, with the desperation of a lonely soul aching to belong to someone. He was wrong. 18 months later, Catherine betrayed him for money from Victor Chen, the rival boss on Chicago's South Side. She sold information about his schedule, about the weak points in his security, about everything she'd learned in the nights she'd lain beside him in bed. The ambush came on a night of relentless rain, when Thorn was on his way home after meeting with partners. 12 gunmen, 4 vehicles boxing him in, and a storm of bullets that lasted 15 minutes and felt endless. He survived only because Reed Sullivan, his loyal right hand, risked his life to drive straight through the blockade and get him to the hospital when blood had already soaked the entire back seat. 3 bullets inside him, 2 weeks in intensive care, and countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, asking why. Why had she done it? Why had he been stupid enough to trust her? Why was he still alive when he should have just died and been done with it? Catherine vanished with the money Victor Chen paid her, and rumor said she'd gone overseas to live a lavish life on money stained with his blood. Thorn didn't chase her. He didn't seek revenge. He simply erased her from his memory as if she'd never existed. But the wound she left behind never healed. It carved itself into his heart like the scar on his cheek, reminding him every day that no one could be trusted, that love was only a lie wrapped in sugar, that he would never make that mistake again. After that, Thorn froze his heart completely, becoming the man all of Chicago feared today. A cold, ruthless mafia boss who knew no mercy. A lonely ghost sitting in the dark corner of a bar every night, wondering if this emptiness was all that was left of his life, while Thorn sat steeped in his own painful memories. Not far away, a woman was quietly mopping the bar's floor with hands hardened by years of labor. Maggie Hartwell was 58, her hair more than half turned silver and twisted into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, her weathered face carved with the wrinkles of time and a worry that never truly loosened its grip. She'd worked at the Obsidian Room for 12 years, every night from 6 in the evening until midnight, wiping spilled liquor from marble tiles, polishing expensive crystal glasses whose price for a single one was probably equal to an entire month of her pay, cleaning up what remained after wealthy patrons left in gleaming cars. She moved through the darkness like a ghost, silent and unseen, exactly the way manual workers were often treated in the world of the rich, visible yet unacknowledged, present yet somehow not existing. But Maggie didn't complain. She was far too used to living in the shadows, far too used to swallowing her pain and taking another step forward for the people she loved. 15 years earlier, on a freezing winter night in the suburbs of Chicago, Maggie was on her way home after an extra shift at a restaurant when she saw a car slam into a lamppost and burst into roaring flames. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight toward the fire while others stood back, watching and calling for help. Inside the car was a young man, unconscious, blood pouring down his forehead, and the flames were already licking toward the driver's seat. Maggie used every ounce of strength she had to wrench open the warped door, reached inside, and dragged the young man out while fire snapped at both her arms. The pain tore through flesh. The burnt stench of hair and skin surged into her nose, but she didn't stop until she'd pulled him far enough away to be safe, only seconds before the gas tank exploded and turned the car into a ball of fire. That young man was the son of Frank Morrison, the manager of the Obsidian Room, a man who'd lost his wife years before and had only his only son left as the reason he kept living. When Frank came to the hospital and saw Maggie lying in a bed with both arms wrapped in white bandages, she gave a weak smile and said, "Any mother would have done the same." Frank cried. The first time in decades he'd cried in front of a stranger, and he swore he'd repay her in any way he could. The burns on Maggie's arms left permanent scars, skin drawn tight and puckered into a tangled web of ridges from her wrists to her elbows. But she never regretted it. Frank kept his promise. He hired her as a janitor at the Obsidian Room, at a wage higher than any job she'd ever had, allowed her to work the night shift so she could care for her family during the day, and treated her like a benefactor for the past 12 years. Maggie's life had never been easy. Her husband, Robert Hartwell, had been a kind, simple construction worker, the man she'd loved since she was 18 and had sworn she'd stay with until their hair turned white and their teeth grew old. But fate was cruel. 17 years earlier, when Phoebe was 10 and Miles was only 2, Robert fell from the 12th floor of a construction site because his safety line snapped. He died on the spot, leaving Maggie alone with 2 small children, a rented apartment close to its lease end, and a tiny insurance payout that wasn't enough to cover even the funeral costs. She remembered that day as if it were etched into bone, the day Phoebe stood beside her father's coffin, with amber eyes gone dry because she'd cried all her tears away, her hand gripping the hand of her 2-year-old brother, who was still too young to understand why Daddy would never come home again. Maggie swore at her husband's grave that she'd raise their children no matter the cost, that she wouldn't let them suffer, that she'd do everything a mother could to make up for the absence of a father. And for 17 years, Maggie kept that promise. She worked every kind of job, from waiting tables to cleaning offices, from doing laundry for others to babysitting for neighbors, sometimes holding 3 jobs at once, just to make enough money for her children to go to school and have food every day. Her hands grew calloused, her back bent from nights spent hunched over the floor. But she never complained, never let her children see her cry, never let them know there were nights she went hungry so she could save the last bit of food for them. She was a mother in the shadows, quietly sacrificing without needing to be seen, quietly enduring without needing to be acknowledged, needing only one thing, that her children could live a better life, and she'd be content. But tonight, as Maggie pushed her mop cart past the VIP area and glanced at the man sitting alone in the dark corner, she knew she was about to do something she'd never dared to do in her entire life. Ask a stranger for help, because her daughter was falling into a desperation Maggie couldn't save her from on her own. Phoebe Hartwell was the reason Maggie was still standing after so many years of wrestling with life, her greatest pride and also the worry that never eased in a mother's heart. 27 years old, with long chestnut brown hair falling down her back, and amber eyes inherited from her late father that always held a stubborn light no hardship could ever put out. She was beautiful, not the dazzling, polished beauty of rich girls, but the raw beauty of a wildflower blooming in barren ground, resilient and radiant in her own way. But if you looked closer, you'd see the dark circles beneath those eyes from too many sleepless nights, the fine features grown thinner than they should have been from skipped meals, and those small shoulders bowed under burdens no woman in her 20s should have had to carry. Phoebe had once been an exceptional finance student at the University of Illinois, one of the brightest in her class, with an almost perfect grade point average and a wide-open future ahead of her. Professors looked at her with expectation. Big companies had started noticing her by her third year, and Phoebe had dreamed of the day she'd graduate, land a good job, and pull her mother and little brother out of the cramped, shabby apartment they'd lived in for so many years. But that dream shattered in her final year of college, when Miles was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition and needed urgent surgery. The family didn't have good enough health insurance. The medical costs piled up like a mountain, and someone had to sacrifice. Phoebe didn't hesitate. She withdrew from school with only a single semester left before graduation, gave up everything she'd built over 4 years, and threw herself into earning money. Her mother cried all night, begging her not to give it up, but Phoebe only held her and said a degree could wait, but her brother couldn't. From that moment on, Phoebe's life became an unending spiral of work and debt. Every day began at 5 a.m, when she woke in a small dark room to get ready for her waitressing shift at a modest diner on the South Side. She carried plates, cleared tables, wiped chairs, smiled at demanding customers and stingy tips from 6 a.m. until 1 p.m. Then she rushed onto a bus across the city to a small law firm in the Loop, where she worked as an administrative assistant from 2 p.m. until 8 p.m, handling paperwork, organizing files, answering phones, and enduring the harassing looks of a boss she couldn't push back against because she was afraid of losing her job. At night, when other people were already asleep, Phoebe sat in front of an old computer in her room to sell things online, posting product ads, replying to customer messages, packing orders to ship out until her eyes blurred with exhaustion, usually around 1 or 2 in the morning. 4 hours of sleep a night if she was lucky, 3 if there were many orders to handle, and some nights she didn't sleep at all because stress headaches came without warning and refused to let go. She lived on black coffee and cheap protein bars, skipped meals so often her stomach had gotten used to a low, constant hunger like an uninvited companion. Her weight dropped to a dangerous point, her collarbones rising under pale, sun-starved skin. But she didn't have time to worry about herself when every dollar she earned already had a destination. Rent, utilities, Miles's medication, installments on hospital bills, money handed to her mother so she wouldn't have to take too many extra hours. Even with 3 jobs at once, Phoebe's income still wasn't enough to pay down the massive medical debt crushing the family. Every month, she looked at the number on the hospital statement and felt like she was trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. The harder she worked, the more the debt seemed to grow, because of interest, because of unexpected charges, because Miles needed another new medication that cost even more. But Phoebe never let anyone see her break. In front of her mother, she always smiled and said everything would be okay. In front of Miles, she stayed bright, talking about the future when he'd get better, and they'd travel together. She hid the nights she cried alone in the bathroom. She hid the moments she stood before the mirror and didn't recognize the hollow face staring back. She hid the fear that no matter how hard she tried, it still wouldn't be enough to save her little brother. Her amber eyes still burned with will, but that flame was starting to flicker under the cold wind of a ruthless reality. Miles Hartwell was the reason Phoebe gave up everything. The heartbeat counting down day by day that wouldn't let her stop for even a single second. 19 years old, he had brown hair like his sister's, warm brown eyes like his mother's, and a gentle smile like the father he'd lost, the one he could barely remember anymore. He was brilliantly intelligent, the kind of intelligence teachers noticed from the moment he entered elementary school, the kind that let him skip 2 grades and graduate high school at 16 as valedictorian. MIT had awarded him a full scholarship, an honor only a small percentage of students across the country ever received, and Miles cried when he held that acceptance letter, because at last he could show his family their sacrifices hadn't been meaningless. But fate was cruel, and his fragile, congenital heart wouldn't let him go any farther. The heart condition had followed him since birth, like a time bomb sitting quiet in his chest, waiting for the day it would explode. Through his childhood years, he wasn't allowed to run like other kids, wasn't allowed to play sports, wasn't allowed to do anything that made his heart race, because they feared the chest pain would come and send him to the emergency room yet again. He grew used to watching life through a window, used to reading books instead of chasing a ball, used to the worried look in his mother's and sister's eyes whenever he coughed once or breathed a little faster than normal. Last year, just as he'd started his 2nd year at MIT, he collapsed in the middle of a lecture hall and was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The doctors said his heart had weakened to the point it couldn't wait any longer. He needed valve replacement surgery within 6 months if he didn't want to face the risk of death. The cost of that surgery was $300,000, an enormous number the Hartwell family could never reach when their health insurance was only the most basic kind, the kind meant for poor people who couldn't afford a better plan. Miles had to withdraw from school and come home, give up the MIT dream he'd worked his whole life to earn, lie in a small room staring at the ceiling and counting each irregular heartbeat tapping out a countdown toward the final day. He hated himself for being his family's burden. Hated that every dollar Phoebe earned with sweat and tears flowed into a bottomless black hole called hospital bills. Hated that he couldn't do anything except lie here and wait, while his sister faded a little more each day. One night, when Phoebe had just come home after a late shift, Miles took her hand in his thin, trembling fingers and told her not to try anymore, to let him go, because he was only a weight dragging the whole family down into the abyss. Phoebe slapped him, the first time in her life she ever hit her little brother, then pulled him into her arms and sobbed in the darkness of their cramped room. She said he was everything she had left, the reason she woke up every morning, the only light in this dark life, and she'd rather die than lose him. "Don't ever say those words again," she whispered into his ear, while her tears soaked his shoulder. "I'll find a way. I promise you. No matter what I have to do, I'll save you." Miles didn't say anything. He only held her tighter and cried with her, because he knew Phoebe didn't speak lightly. She really would burn herself to keep him warm, and that hurt him more than any pain in his chest ever could. They were everything to each other. Two fatherless siblings raised in poverty, with only each other and a mother worn down by work to hold them up against this wide, ruthless world. Phoebe would do anything to save Miles. She'd sworn that at their father's grave, and she would keep that oath no matter what price she had to pay. But the vow to save her brother wasn't the only thing weighing on Phoebe's shoulders, because another devil stalked her every day at work, a predator in an expensive suit with a greasy smile that made her shiver every time she had to face him. Preston Whitmore III, 45 years old, was a senior attorney and Phoebe's direct boss at the law firm, where she worked the afternoon shift as an administrative assistant. He was the kind of man born with a silver spoon in his mouth, raised in a mansion in a wealthy suburb, educated at prestigious private schools, then graduating from a top-tier law school without ever truly having to struggle, because his family's money had already opened every door. He had a wife who was the daughter of a powerful federal judge, 3 children in private schools whose yearly tuition equaled Phoebe's entire annual pay, and a mansion in Lincoln Park worth millions of dollars. On the surface, Preston Whitmore III was the picture of success society admired. But beneath that glossy varnish was a predator wearing human skin, a male beast that lived to hunt the weak who couldn't fight back. For the past 6 months, since the day Phoebe walked into the firm, Preston had targeted her the way a hunter fixed on a young deer separated from the herd. It started with stares that lingered too long on her body when she passed down the hallway, the kind of look that made her feel stripped bare even though she was fully dressed. Then came the accidental touches when she handed him files, his hand brushing her wrist, her shoulder, sometimes lower, and Phoebe had to use every bit of restraint not to scream or shove him away, because she knew what the consequences would be. Crude comments about her appearance, about the way her skirt clung to her body, about how she'd be prettier if she smiled more and relaxed more, always whispered into her ear when no one else was around. Phoebe wanted to report him, wanted to scream in his face that he was disgusting, wanted to smash that straight nose he'd had surgically perfected, but she couldn't. Preston's wife was a federal judge's daughter. His family had connections to half of Chicago's upper class, and there had already been 3 women before Phoebe who tried to report his harassment, only to end up fired for fabricated reasons. Their reputations smeared, and their cases quietly settled with hush money and non-disclosure agreements. Preston Whitmore III was the kind of monster the law protected, and he knew it, enjoyed it, used it to hunt without ever fearing punishment. Last week, he called Phoebe into his private office, closed the door with that smile she'd learned to dread, and delivered an ultimatum that froze her in place. The firm's annual gala would be held this weekend, he said in a tone as if he were granting her a favor, and he wanted Phoebe to go with him as his girlfriend. It wasn't an offer, it was a demand. If she refused, he would make sure she was fired for poor performance, and with a bad reference from him, she would never find another office job anywhere in Chicago again. Phoebe stood in his office with her legs trembling and bitterness clogging her throat, wanting to refuse outright. But thinking of Miles waiting for surgery money, thinking of her mother bent under work, thinking of the bills stacked on the table that she didn't know how she'd ever pay. She said nothing. She only asked for more time to think, and Preston smiled in triumph like a man who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. That night, Phoebe came home with a face gone pale and eyes turned empty. She didn't eat dinner. She didn't speak to her mother even when Maggie asked with worried questions. She walked straight into the cramped bathroom, locked the door, turned the water on as loud as she could so no one would hear, then sank down onto the cold tile floor and sobbed like a child. She cried from desperation, from rage, from disgust at herself when she imagined having to go with Preston for even a single night, because she knew if she refused her brother might die, but if she agreed her soul would die with him. Maggie stood outside the bathroom door, listening to her daughter cry, her heart feeling like someone was crushing it in a fist. And it was that very night that the crazy thought of the mysterious man in the bar began to take shape inside her mind. That night at the Obsidian Room, the clock had already struck 10, and the bar was thinning out the way it always did on weeknights. The last guests drifted out with laughter that faded as they went, leaving the wide space steeped in dim golden light and the soft jazz drifting from speakers hidden inside the walls. Thorne still sat in his usual place in the VIP section, his second glass of whiskey already half gone, his cold gray eyes fixed on an empty distance as if he were speaking to the ghosts of his past. Not far away, Maggie pushed her mop cart back and forth in front of the VIP area for the 5th time, her heart hammering inside her aging chest, her hands gripping the broom handle so tightly her knuckles went white. She'd been turning this over in her mind for 2 days, since the night she heard Phoebe crying in the bathroom, weighing every possible option and finding no other way out. She didn't have money to hire someone to pretend. She didn't have relatives or friends she trusted enough to ask. And time was running out, because the gala was only 2 days away. The mysterious man sitting in that dark corner was her only hope, even if that hope was as thin as a thread in a storm. Over months of watching, Maggie had seen him treat the staff with a respect few wealthy patrons ever showed. She'd seen him leave generous tips without making a show of it. She'd seen him help her to her feet when she'd accidentally slipped near his table, without a flicker of annoyance or contempt. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he did. She only knew there was something in those cold eyes that reminded her of her husband's gaze, hard on the outside but warm underneath, the look of a good man trying to hide his heart from the world. Maggie drew a long breath, let go of the broom handle, and walked toward the VIP area on trembling legs. Every step was a battle with fear, with the shame of having to lower herself to beg a stranger, with the terror that he would refuse and everything would dissolve into nothing. But she thought of Phoebe withering a little more each day. She thought of Miles counting down each heartbeat. And she knew she was willing to do anything, even fall to her knees before a stranger if that was what it took. When she stopped at Thorne's table, he looked up, a flicker of surprise passing through his gray eyes, because this was the first time in 12 years anyone had dared approach his table without his signal. Maggie didn't speak at first. She took one more step, bent low, and took his hand in her calloused hands marked by old burn scars. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling but steady with determination. "I know this isn't proper and you have every right to send me away, but please, just listen to me for a few minutes." Thorne didn't pull his hand back, and he didn't say a word. He only watched her with an expression she couldn't read, and that silence gave Maggie the courage to go on. She told him about Phoebe, about her 27-year-old daughter who'd given up her future to carry the family, about 3 jobs every day that were burning her down like a candle lit at both ends. She told him about Miles, about a heart ticking down, about a surgery that cost $300,000 and nowhere to find the money. And she told him about Preston Whitmore, about a devil wearing human skin who was forcing her daughter into a corner, about the ultimatum to attend the gala as his girlfriend or lose her job, about how Phoebe would lose the only income that might save her brother if no one went with her that night. Tears rolled down Maggie's wrinkled face as she spoke. "I've got nothing to repay you with. I'm just a poor old janitor, but I've watched you for months, and I know you're a kind man. I've seen how you treat people like me, people others pretend are invisible, and I know you're not cruel, even if you try to look that way. Please, I'm begging you, help my daughter for one night. Pretend to be her boyfriend and take her to that party so that man can't touch her. Just one night, and then you can forget us as if you never met us. But that one night could save my daughter's life." She lifted her face and looked at Thorne with eyes red from tears. Desperation and hope braided together, waiting for his answer the way a condemned soul waited for a sentence. Thorne sat in silence for so long that Maggie started to think he would call security to drag her away for daring to bother an important guest. But he didn't. He only looked at her with gray eyes so deep they felt like two cold abysses, and there was something in that gaze Maggie couldn't name. The tear-red eyes of the old mother kneeling before him stirred a memory Thorne had buried for nearly 30 years. A memory of a woman with eyes just like that, reddened from crying too much, from hurting too long, from knowing she was about to leave her son, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. His mother died of cancer when he was 8, in an underfunded public hospital, back when his father hadn't built an empire yet, when money was only enough for cheap pain pills and not enough for a surgery that could have saved her life. He remembered that last night as clearly as if it were carved into him. The way his mother held his hand in her thin, ice-cold fingers and whispered that he should live well, that he should become a good man, that he shouldn't let darkness swallow his heart. He promised her through tears, but life shoved him far from that promise, turning him into the monster his mother never would have wanted to see. The last time Thorne cried was the night his mother closed her eyes, and since then he'd forgotten what it felt like to have tears run down his cheeks. But now, watching this old mother kneel and beg for her daughter, he felt something begin to crack inside the ice that had frozen solid for decades. Not pity, not weakness, something he'd believed had died long ago, shifting, trying to wake. "Why do you think I'd agree?" Thorne asked at last, his voice low and cold the way it always was, but without the usual threat underneath it. "I don't know you. I don't know your daughter, and I've got no reason to help." Maggie looked up at him, tears still falling, but her eyes lit with something like fierce belief as she answered, "Because you've got eyes just like my husband's, sir. My husband was a man of few words too, cold on the outside, never showing emotion in front of others, but he loved his family with his whole heart, and he was willing to do anything for the people he loved. I see that look in you every night when you sit alone here, the look of a lonely man hiding his heart, not the look of an evil man. I might be wrong, you might refuse and I'll accept it, but a mother's heart tells me you're not as cruel as you want people to think you are." Thorne watched her, and in that moment he saw his mother. He saw the quiet sacrifice of women who would do anything for their children, even lower themselves to beg a stranger in despair. He'd sworn he would never trust anyone again after Catherine. He'd built his walls so high no one could reach him. But this old mother didn't want his money. She didn't want his power. She only wanted one night, one act of kindness that could save her daughter from a predator's hands. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, Thorne Valencia did something for no advantage, no calculation, no power, no money. He nodded slowly and said, "One night. I'll help your daughter for one night." Maggie froze for a heartbeat as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Then she broke into sobs, bowed her head over his hand, and stumbled out words of gratitude that barely formed. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much," she said between choking cries. "You don't know what this means to my family. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Thorne drew his hand back gently, not out of irritation, but because he wasn't used to being touched without an agenda behind it. "No need to repay me," he said shortly. "Just tell me the time, the place, and the name of the man who's pressuring your daughter." Maggie wiped her tears with her sleeve and began to explain in detail. The gala was at the Peninsula Hotel on Saturday night. Preston Whitmore, III, was the man's name. Her daughter's name was Phoebe Hartwell, and she lived in apartment number 12 on the 3rd floor on the south side. When Thorne heard the name Preston Whitmore, his brow tightened slightly, a chill passing through his gray eyes because he knew that man, a man who used to work for one of his rivals, and now was hunting this mother's daughter. "Interesting," he murmured too softly for Maggie to hear, while she was still crying and thanking him, as if he'd just handed her a miracle. Thorne got back to his penthouse on the top floor of a skyscraper in downtown when the clock had already struck 11 at night, but he had no intention of sleeping. He poured himself another whiskey, sank into a black leather chair facing a wall of glass that framed Chicago in a shimmer of lights, and lifted his phone to call Reed Sullivan. Reed answered on the second ring even though it was late, his voice clear and alert, as if he never slept, waiting for orders from his boss the way he always did. "I need information on 2 people," Thorne said, short and without any detours. "Phoebe Hartwell and Preston Whitmore III, as detailed as possible. Get it to me before morning." Reed didn't ask why. He'd worked for Thorne long enough to know questions were a luxury nobody needed. He only said yes, and ended the call so he could start. Thorne sat in the darkness, staring out at a city that was asleep, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. He'd agreed to help a complete stranger. He'd broken the rule of not getting involved with anyone, the rule he'd kept unshaken for nearly 20 years, and he didn't understand why. Maybe because the old mother's tear-red eyes looked too much like his own mother's. Maybe because that line about eyes cold on the outside but warm within had touched something he thought was long dead. Or maybe he was simply sick of the dull life that repeated itself day after day, and he wanted to do something different, even if it was only for one night. Whatever the reason, he'd given his word, and Thorne Valencia didn't take his word back. At 2 a.m, his phone vibrated with a message from Reed, along with 2 detailed file dossiers. He opened the first file on Phoebe Hartwell and began to read in the cold blue light of the screen. 27 years old, born and raised in Chicago. Father died when she was 10, public schools, graduated high school as salutatorian, accepted to the University of Illinois in finance with a partial scholarship, an almost perfect grade point average for 4 years, once recommended by professors for internship programs at major financial firms, a bright future ahead until she withdrew during her final year for family reasons. Currently working 3 jobs, morning shift as a waitress at a diner on the South Side, afternoon shift as an administrative assistant at Harrison & Associates, and at night selling online, totaling about 18 hours of labor every day. No boyfriend, no social life, no sign she had time for anything beyond work and family. A clean record without a blemish, no bad debt beyond the medical debt for her brother, no involvement in any illegal activity, no connection to any organization Thorne needed to be wary of. He scrolled down and stopped at the attached photo, a still taken from the diner's security camera. The image not sharp, but clear enough for him to see her face. Thorne had seen many beautiful women in his life, supermodels, powerful businesswomen, wealthy heiresses, but there was something about the girl in this photo that wouldn't let him look away. It wasn't glamorous, polished beauty. It was those amber eyes staring straight into the lens, as if challenging the entire world. The gaze of someone who refused to bend even while life tried to grind her down. He kept looking at the photo longer than he needed to, then opened the second file on Preston Whitmore III, and what he read made his gray eyes turn a few degrees colder. Senior attorney, privileged family, wife, the daughter of a federal judge, and he'd once worked for Victor Chen as legal counsel for money laundering transactions before moving to his current firm. 3 sexual harassment lawsuits in the past 5 years, all quietly settled with hush money and non-disclosure agreements. Thorne curled his mouth into a cold smile in the dark. Interesting, he murmured. A man who once served Victor Chen was now hunting the daughter of the mother who'd come to him for help. He closed the file and looked out at the city again. This Saturday night didn't look like it was going to be as boring as he'd thought. Saturday night arrived faster than Phoebe expected, and she stood in front of the mirror in her cramped little room, with her heart pounding, not knowing whether it was anxiety or fear or both. The dress she wore belonged to Nina, the only best friend she still kept in touch with from college, a deep blue evening gown that hugged her body, its open back just daring enough to feel sensual without crossing into vulgar. Nina had brought the dress to her apartment that morning, along with silver heels and a simple set of jewelry, and she'd practically forced Phoebe to sit still while she did her hair and makeup, because she knew Phoebe would never do these things for herself. "You look beautiful," Nina said when she finished. "More beautiful than you think, and tonight you're going to make that bastard Preston regret he ever dared touch you." Phoebe only gave a thin smile and thanked her, not saying she didn't care what Preston thought, that she only wanted tonight to be over so she could go back to the life she knew. Her mother had told her about the man who would pick her up, a mysterious gentleman from the bar where she worked, someone who'd agreed to help without asking for anything. Phoebe didn't believe in things like that. She didn't believe anyone could be kind enough to help a complete stranger without an agenda, but she had no other choice, so she accepted it. Exactly at 7 in the evening, the sound of an engine rose from the street below, and Phoebe looked out the window to see a glossy black Maybach parked in front of her shabby apartment building, standing out like a diamond in a trash heap. She'd never seen a car like that in real life. Only in luxury magazines she'd glanced through while clearing tables for customers at the diner. She drew a deep breath, took the small clutch Nina had lent her, and stepped out of the apartment on legs that trembled slightly from the heels and from whatever waited ahead. When she opened the building's front door and walked outside, the man leaning against the Maybach turned to look at her, and time seemed to stop for an endless moment. Thorne Valencia stood there in a perfectly tailored black suit that fit his tall, powerful frame, a crisp white shirt with no tie, the collar left open just enough, black hair cut short and neat, and cold gray eyes fixed on her as if he were reading every secret she tried to hide. A faint scar ran from his temple down across his left cheekbone, and instead of making him less attractive, it made him look dangerously magnetic, like a black panther crouched before it sprang. Phoebe froze on the steps, forgetting how to breathe, forgetting everything except the man walking toward her with steady steps and eyes that never left her face. Thorn wasn't doing much better, even though he kept it buried beneath his familiar mask of ice. The security camera photo didn't do her justice, he thought as he watched her standing there in the yellow lobby light spilling out behind her, the deep blue dress highlighting her pale skin, her chestnut brown hair pinned up to reveal the elegant line of her neck. She was thinner than he'd imagined, her collarbones sharp beneath her skin like a reminder of meals she'd skipped. But her amber eyes were exactly like the photo, burning with a fierce resilience he'd never seen in anyone else. "Miss Hartwell." He spoke first because she was still standing there like a statue. "I'm Thorn, the man your mother asked for help." Phoebe blinked as if waking from a dream, gave a small nod, and stepped down the last few steps on legs she forced not to shake. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice calmer than she felt. "My mother told me about you." Thorn didn't answer. He only opened the car door for her and waited until she slid inside before he walked around to the other side. Inside the Maybach, the scent of high-end leather and the faint trace of his cologne wrapped around Phoebe, making her feel as if she'd stepped into a world completely different from the shabby one she lived in every day. They sat beside each other in taut silence as the car began to move, neither of them knowing what to say. Finally, Thorn spoke, his voice low and even, as if he were talking about the weather. "We need to agree on a few things before we get there. I'll play your longtime boyfriend. We met through work when I came to look into legal services for my company. I'm a businessman. I own Valencia Industries, and we operate in investment and real estate. You can call me Thorn, and I'll call you Phoebe, if you're comfortable with that." Phoebe nodded, trying to lock every detail into her mind even as her thoughts spun from how close he was. "Valencia Industries," she repeated. "Longtime boyfriend. Met through work. I've got it." Thorn glanced at her once, then looked back out the window. "One more thing," he said, his tone softer but carrying something heavy underneath it. "If anyone makes you uncomfortable tonight, anyone at all, you tell me." Phoebe turned to look at him, startled by that, and met cold gray eyes that held something she couldn't name. She didn't know who this man really was. She didn't know why he'd agreed to help, but in that moment she felt safe for the first time in many months. The peninsula Chicago was glowing tonight like a palace out of a fairy tale, with thousands of crystal lights hanging above the high ceiling, gleaming white marble floors reflecting warm golden light, and towering vases of fresh flowers nearly 2 meters tall placed everywhere, spilling rich fragrance into the air. The annual gala for Harrison and Associates gathered hundreds of guests in expensive suits and dazzling evening gowns, attorneys, judges, business people, and even familiar faces from politics, all chatting brightly over champagne and delicate plates of food. Phoebe had seen this kind of luxury from a distance when she cleaned offices after big meetings, but she'd never been allowed to step into it as a guest, and the sheer opulence nearly made her stop at the entrance. Thorn felt her hesitation. His hand settled lightly on the bare stretch of her back through the cut of her dress, the warmth of his palm spreading across her skin, making her flinch, but also steadying her. "Don't worry," he murmured close to her ear, low enough that only she could hear. "You're here with me, and no one will dare touch you." Phoebe didn't understand why those simple words made her believe him so completely, but she lifted her chin and walked in beside him with a steadier kind of confidence. Every gaze in the ballroom swung toward them the moment they appeared, some drawn by the deep blue dress that highlighted Phoebe's raw, natural beauty, some drawn by the tall, cold man at her side who looked like he'd stepped out of a Mafia film, and most of all because no one recognized who they were. Whispers rippled through the room. "Who are they? Who is she? That man looks familiar. He must be important to walk in with that kind of calm." Phoebe felt exposed under hundreds of prying eyes, wanting to shrink back, but Thorn's hand on her back was a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. They hadn't taken more than a few steps when Preston Whitmore III pushed through the crowd toward them, his face holding a polite social smile, but his eyes burning with anger as he saw Phoebe arrive with another man, instead of alone the way he'd expected. "Phoebe," he called her name in a sugary voice that still carried irritation underneath. "You're here. I've been waiting for you all night." "And who is this?" Phoebe opened her mouth to answer, but Thorn moved first. He stepped half a pace forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her like an invisible shield, and met Preston's eyes with a stare as cold as ice. "Thorn Valencia," he said in a low, even voice without emotion. "Phoebe's boyfriend. Very pleased to meet you." The impact of the name Valencia hit Preston like an invisible punch to the face. His color drained in a split second, the polite smile freezing on his lips, and Phoebe could have sworn she saw him tremble before he forced himself back into composure. "Va Valencia," he stammered, as in Valencia Industries. Thorn curled his mouth into a smile, a cold smile that didn't reach his steel-gray eyes. "Exactly," he answered simply. "I see you've heard of my company. I hope what you've heard has been good." Preston swallowed hard, and it was obvious what he knew about Valencia Industries, and the family behind it wasn't anything good, especially for a man who'd once worked for Victor Chen and understood exactly how Chicago's underworld really ran. In that world, the name Valencia meant absolute power and death for anyone who dared resist, and Preston Whitmore III might have been a vile predator, but he wasn't stupid enough to lay a hand on someone belonging to Thorn Valencia. Of course, he said, trying to sound normal, but his voice was clearly shaking. "I'm just Phoebe's colleague at the firm. I didn't know she had a boyfriend. I'm sorry for bothering you both." Thorn didn't bother answering. He only placed his hand at Phoebe's waist and guided her past Preston, as if the man were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the way, leaving the predator frozen in the middle of the ballroom, his face gone a sick green, and his legs looking as if they might buckle. The evening went better than Phoebe had imagined, and for the first time in many months she felt like she could breathe. Thorn played the boyfriend so perfectly she almost forgot it was all an act. He pulled out her chair for her, brought her food when she mentioned which dish she liked, rested his hand over hers while speaking with other guests as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They talked more than she'd expected, about small things like favorite foods and music they liked to listen to, and Phoebe surprised herself by feeling genuinely comfortable beside this cold man. He listened when she spoke, truly listened instead of pretending the way other men she'd met had done, his gray eyes fixed on her with an attention that left her both flustered and strangely warmed inside. But everything collapsed close to midnight when Preston Whitmore III appeared again, this time with a face flushed red from alcohol and eyes blazing with the anger of a man whose prey had been taken away. He'd been drinking all night to swallow the humiliation of seeing Phoebe happy beside another man, and the liquor gave him just enough stupid courage to do something he would regret for the rest of his life. He strode straight to Phoebe and Thorn's table, shoved aside a guest who stood in his way until the man stumbled, and shouted loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "So this is our little gold digger," he spat, each word soaked in contempt and drunkenness. "I was wondering where you got this expensive dress. Turns out you found yourself a rich man to cling to." The ballroom went silent as if someone had pressed a mute button, hundreds of eyes snapping toward their table with shock and hungry curiosity. Phoebe felt blood rush into her face, her ears ringing, her heart hammering as humiliation hit her too suddenly to defend against it. "Look at her," Preston went on, his voice growing louder and meaner. "A broke little administrative assistant suddenly shows up in an expensive gown next to a billionaire who's supposed to believe she isn't a gold digger. I bet she used her body to get every bit of this." Phoebe surged to her feet, her amber eyes burning and wet with rage and shame, her throat tightening until no words would come. She wanted to scream in his face that he was the disgusting one, wanted to slap that drunken grin right off him, but her body felt frozen under hundreds of staring eyes and the whispers that began to rise around them. Thorn stayed seated for a single second, his gray eyes never leaving Preston, and Phoebe could have sworn the temperature in the room dropped a few degrees under the force of his gaze alone. Then he stood up slowly, the movement smooth as a black panther stretching before it struck, and walked toward Preston with steady steps that didn't hurry at all. Preston stopped talking when he saw Thorn coming, the last shred of survival instinct slicing through the haze of alcohol to tell him he'd just made a lethal mistake. Thorn halted right in front of him, close enough to smell the harsh stench of liquor on the drunk man's breath, and leaned down to speak into his ear in a whisper as cold as ice. "I'm going to say this slowly so your alcohol-soaked brain can understand it," Thorn said in a flat voice, as if he were reading a weather report. "If you open your mouth and say one more word about her, I'll make sure you never open your mouth again. And before you decide that's an empty threat, let me remind you that I've got a complete file on the 3 sexual harassment cases you paid to silence, including the names, addresses, and statements of the victims. One phone call, and it'll all be on the front page by morning. And I don't think your judge father-in-law is going to enjoy seeing his son-in-law exposed as a pervert in the headlines." Preston turned deathly pale, his eyes widening in horror as he realized the man in front of him didn't just know his dark past. He had enough power to destroy his life in a single breath. Preston stumbled back 2 steps, nearly falling when his foot caught on a chair, and started babbling apologies in a trembling voice. I'm sorry, he stammered like a child caught doing something wrong. "I'm too drunk. I didn't know what I was saying. Please, Mr. Valencia, don't do anything to me. I'll never bother Miss Hartwell again, I swear." Thorne didn't spare him another second. He turned and walked back to Phoebe, who was shaking with emotion, and spoke softly, so only she could hear. "We're leaving." He placed his hand on her back and guided her out of the ballroom, leaving Preston standing like a statue in the heavy silence of hundreds of guests, watching a powerful man come undone. Thorne didn't take Phoebe out through the main entrance. He led her down a quiet hallway to a wide balcony overlooking Chicago at night, where there was no one but the 2 of them, and the city lights glittering like falling stars beneath a deep black sky. Phoebe stopped at the railing, both hands gripping the icy metal, and the tears she'd held back all night finally spilled out, unstoppable. She cried from the shame of being humiliated in front of hundreds of people, cried from anger at herself for not being able to fight back, cried because she realized that no matter how hard she tried, in the eyes of someone like Preston, she would always be nothing more than a broke little assistant who didn't deserve respect. Her shoulders shook with each choking sob, and she hated herself for letting a man she'd just met see her this weak. Thorne stood a few steps away, silent, waiting without pushing her or showing irritation, giving her the space to pour out everything she'd been carrying. When her crying finally began to quiet, he spoke, his voice lower and gentler than usual. "You don't have to be ashamed," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong. He's the one who should be ashamed, not you." Phoebe turned to him with eyes red and wet, loose strands of hair clinging to her damp cheeks, and asked in a hoarse voice, rough from crying, "Why did you protect me like that? You don't even know who I am." Thorne looked at her for a long moment, so long Phoebe thought he wouldn't answer, his gray eyes deep, as if he were searching for something inside her amber gaze. Then he said, his voice as light as a breath, "Because you deserve to be protected." Only 4 simple words, but the way he spoke them made Phoebe feel as if someone had just wrapped arms around her bleeding heart and told it everything would be okay. She stood there staring at him, not knowing what to say, not knowing what she was supposed to feel about this mysterious man who'd entered her life less than a day ago, yet had made her feel more valued than anyone ever had in all her 27 years. A cold wind swept across the balcony, carrying the bite of an autumn night in Chicago, and Phoebe shivered in her thin, backless dress. Thorne didn't say anything. He simply took off his black suit jacket and stepped closer, gently settling it over her bare, trembling shoulders. When he lifted the jacket higher to cover her neck, his fingers brushed the soft skin there by accident, and both of them went still, as if time had stopped. Phoebe looked up at him, and he was looking down at her, the distance between them so close she could count his thick dark lashes and see her own reflection in those deep gray eyes. Her heart pounded so fast she was afraid he could hear it, and she realized his heart was pounding just as hard beneath the thin shirt when his chest brushed lightly against her shoulder. No one spoke. No one moved. There was only the sound of wind and the lights of Chicago flickering below like millions of stars fallen to earth. In that moment, Phoebe knew something had changed. Some invisible thread had been tied between her and this mysterious man. And even if she didn't know where it would lead, she knew she wasn't the same as she'd been before she stepped into this night. A week had passed since the night of the gala, and Phoebe couldn't stop thinking about the man who'd draped his suit jacket over her shoulders on that balcony. She still worked 3 shifts a day the way she always did, still came home after midnight with exhaustion in her bones. But now, in the rare moments when she had any time to herself, the image of those deep gray eyes rose up and haunted her. She remembered the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd protected her, the way his fingers had brushed her neck by accident and sent a jolt through her entire body, and she found herself wondering whether he was thinking about her too, or whether that night had been nothing more to him than a small act of charity he'd already forgotten. Preston had resigned from the law firm on the 2nd day after the gala, for personal reasons that no one dared question, and Phoebe no longer had to live with the fear of being harassed. But none of that explained why her chest still ached whenever she thought about Thorne. On the Friday night after the gala, when Miles was asleep and her mother had gone to her night shift, Phoebe sat in front of her old laptop and typed 3 words into the search bar. Thorn, Valencia. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe she only wanted to know more about the man who'd stepped into her life and then vanished like a dream. But what appeared on the screen left her frozen. Valencia Industries, the largest investment and real estate company in Chicago. But behind that legitimate shell were rumors stacked like shadows. Whispers of ties to the underworld. The Valencia family, one of the most powerful mafia families in the city, with a history stretching back decades. And Thorn Valencia, the third-generation heir, said to have taken over the empire at 18 after his father was assassinated. The articles didn't have hard proof because no one dared step forward to testify, but the rumors of rivals vanishing without a trace, of businesses suddenly collapsing after refusing to cooperate, of the Valencia family's influence spreading from politics into the business world, were enough to make Phoebe shiver. She snapped the laptop shut with trembling hands, her heart racing with fear and something else she didn't dare name. The man who'd held her in the cold wind that night was a mafia boss, a man all of Chicago feared, and she'd let her heart start to respond to him like a moth to flame. She should forget him. She should be grateful for his help, and then go on with her life as if they'd never met. But something inside her refused to let his shadow go. The next morning, Phoebe had barely woken after 4 hours of sleep when her phone rang with Nina's name on the screen. She answered with a voice still thick with sleep. But what Nina said made her shoot upright, as if she'd been stung. "Phoebe!" Nina yelled into the phone in disbelief. "Someone just paid the entire cost of Miles's surgery. I checked the hospital system, and the $300,000 bill is marked paid in full by an anonymous transfer last night." Phoebe stood frozen in the middle of the room, her phone nearly slipping from her hand, and she knew instantly who had done it. Only one person knew about Miles's condition. Only one person had enough money to cover $300,000 without thinking. Only one person had promised her mother he'd help for one night, and had clearly done far more than that. Phoebe felt her chest tighten until she could hardly breathe, not knowing whether to thank him or to be furious, because she didn't want to owe anyone anything, especially not a mafia boss she'd only just learned the truth about. She needed to see him. She needed to look into his eyes and ask why. She needed to understand why a man like him would do this for her family. That night, instead of going home after her shift, Phoebe took a bus to the Gold Coast and stood in front of the Obsidian Room with her heart pounding, determined to face the man who'd turned her life upside down in a single night. Phoebe stepped into the Obsidian Room with her heart pounding hard in her chest. She told the receptionist she was there to see her mother, Maggie Hartwell, and she was allowed inside. The bar was busier than she'd expected, filled with elegant patrons sipping liquor and talking beneath dim golden light. But her eyes searched for only one man, and she knew exactly where he was the moment she spotted the shadowed VIP corner in the deepest part of the room. Thorn sat there the way he did every night, alone with his familiar glass of whiskey, and when his gray eyes met her amber eyes from across the distance, she saw him frown in brief surprise, then straighten in his seat. Phoebe didn't wait. She walked straight toward him with decisive steps, despite the tremble in her legs, and stopped right in front of his table with a steady gaze. "It was you, wasn't it?" she asked bluntly. "The money for my brother's surgery, $300,000, you paid it." Thorn looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. No denial, no explanation, only a simple admission as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Phoebe felt her eyes sting, the emotions she'd been holding for days rising like a flood about to break, and she said in a voice that shook but wouldn't bend, "I didn't ask you for that. My mother only asked you to help for one night, not to pay to save my brother. I don't want to owe you, or anyone." Thorn rose from his chair. He was a full head taller than she was, and the closeness forced her to tilt her face up, but she didn't step back, even though her heart beat like a war drum. "That's not a debt," he said, his voice low and gentle enough that she had to strain to catch it through the distant jazz. "It's something I wanted to do. No one forced me. No one asked. I did it because I wanted to." "Why?" Phoebe asked, her eyes wet and locked on his gray eyes that didn't feel as cold as they used to. "Why do you care about my family like this? Who are you to do these things?" She went silent for a second, then spoke again, softer but no less steady. "I know who you are now. I looked you up. I know you're Mafia. I know you're the boss of the Valencia family, the man this whole city fears." Thorn didn't react. His face stayed calm, as if she'd just mentioned the weather instead of the darkest secret of his life, and he only asked in an even voice, "And you're afraid of me?" Phoebe wanted to say yes. She wanted to turn around and run and never look back, to protect herself from this dangerous man before it was too late. But what came out of her mouth was the bare truth she couldn't deny. "I should be afraid," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I should turn around and run and forget you like I never met you. But I can't. I can't stop thinking about you. About that night on the balcony. About the way you looked at me like I was something precious. Not some broke little assistant anyone could humiliate. And I hate myself for it." Thorne stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his warm cologne and the faint whiskey in his breath, and he lifted a hand to touch her cheek as if he feared she would shatter if he used any force at all. "Do you know why I did all of it?" he asked, his voice rough as if he were saying something he didn't quite believe he'd ever say. "Because you're the first light I've seen after so many years living in darkness. Because your eyes look at me like a human being instead of a monster. Because since that night I haven't been able to stop thinking about you either, no matter how hard I've tried." Phoebe's tears slid down her cheeks, over his fingers against her skin, and she didn't know whether she was crying from fear or happiness or both. "You shouldn't love anyone," she whispered, "and I shouldn't love someone like you." Thorne lowered his head until his forehead touched hers, their breath mingling, and he said in a voice low as a sigh, "I know, but I stopped doing what I should a long time ago." Then he kissed her, gentle and slow, as if he were afraid she'd disappear if he rushed. A kiss tender yet desperate. The kiss of two lonely souls who had just found each other in a dark, ruthless world. Phoebe closed her eyes and kissed him back, no longer thinking about right and wrong or consequences, only knowing that in the arms of this dangerous man, she felt safer than anywhere she'd ever known. Rumors that Thorne Valencia had a weakness spread through the underworld, like fire racing across dry grass, and Victor Chen was the first to decide to use it. Victor had waited for a chance to bring Thorne down for years, ever since Thorne's father was alive and the two families had been sworn enemies. But the Valencia family was too strong and Thorne was too careful, so Victor couldn't find a crack. Now, when he learned that the coldest boss in Chicago was in love with the daughter of a poor janitor and had even spent $300,000 to pay the family's hospital bills, Victor knew this was the chance of a lifetime. He didn't target Phoebe because he knew Thorne would guard her like a treasure. Instead, he went after the weaker link, Maggie Hartwell, the older mother with no one to protect her when she walked home alone at night on the empty streets of Chicago. Maggie was kidnapped on a Wednesday night just after she left the Obsidian Room following her shift. 2 black vehicles forced her into an alley, and everything happened so fast she didn't even have time to scream. When Thorne received Victor Chen's call at midnight, Victor's voice crackled with triumph through the phone. "Your janitor is with me. If you want her alive, come to dock number 7 alone within 1 hour. Bring anyone, and she dies." Thorne stood in his penthouse with the phone shaking in his hand from rage, his gray eyes turning so cold they could have frozen the entire room. Phoebe was beside him because they'd spent every moment they could together since their first kiss 2 weeks ago. And she saw the change in his face with fear rising in her chest. "My mother," she whispered, her voice trembling as Thorne ended the call and looked at her with pain in his eyes. "They took my mother, didn't they?" Thorne didn't lie to her. He nodded and took both her hands in his, warm but strong. "I'll bring your mother back," he said with a fierce determination and a promise that couldn't be broken. "I promise you, no matter what it costs, I won't let her be hurt." Phoebe cried and clung to him, begging him not to go alone. But Thorne only kissed her forehead and told her to trust him, then walked out the door. What Victor didn't know was that Reed Sullivan had been watching every move of the Chen crew for weeks after discovering they were planning something. And when Thorne arrived at dock number 7 alone as demanded, Reed's 20 gunmen had already surrounded the place in secret from every direction, waiting for the signal. The dock in the dead of night was cold and deserted, with only the dim yellow light of old lampposts spilling onto black water slick with oil. Victor stood there with more than a dozen gunmen around him, and Maggie was tied up, kneeling on the ground, her mouth sealed with tape, her old eyes full of fear and also full of regret as she watched Thorne walk toward her. "Thorne Valencia came alone, just like we agreed," Victor sneered. "But you think I'm going to let her go? You and her are both going to die here tonight." Thorne didn't answer. He only looked at Maggie with a steadying gaze, then gave Reed the signal. Gunfire erupted like thunder, shattering the silence of the night, bullets screaming from every direction as Reed's men spilled out from behind containers and hidden corners, turning the dock into a blood-soaked battlefield. Thorne lunged for Maggie in the chaos, shielding her with his own body when one of Victor's men aimed a gun at them and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through Thorne's left shoulder. He clenched his teeth against the ripping pain. But he didn't let go of Maggie. He kept covering her until the final shots died away. Victor Chen lay motionless on the ground with a bullet through his head, his crew collapsing in an instant as the survivors threw down their weapons and surrendered. Reed ran to Thorne with worry etched across his face. Blood was soaking through Thorne's white shirt, a dark red pool spreading across the cold concrete. But Thorne didn't care about his own wound. He only untied Maggie and helped her stand, asking if she was all right, in a weak voice drained by blood loss. Maggie clung to him and sobbed, not caring that his blood was soaking into her clothes, and she asked between broken breaths, "Why would you risk your life for me like that? I'm just an old janitor nobody even knows." Thorne gave a faint smile, his gray eyes already dimming from the blood he was losing, and answered in a whisper that still carried raw sincerity, "Because you're the mother of the woman I love." Then he collapsed in Maggie's arms as the wail of an ambulance siren grew louder, rushing toward the dock. 2 years later, the obsidian room was still as radiant as ever beneath its dim golden lights and its luxurious black velvet chairs. But one thing had changed completely. The woman behind the bar no longer held a mop. She was directing the staff with the calm authority of a true owner. Maggie Hartwell, 60 years old now, had become the legal owner of the obsidian room, a gift Thorne had placed in her hands as thanks for giving him the most precious thing in this world, a family. She no longer had to stay up late scrubbing floors or worry about rent at the end of the month. Instead, she devoted her time to caring for the bar like it was her own child, and she waited for the evenings when her family would gather together. Frank Morrison was still at her side as an advisor, and their friendship had quietly grown into something deeper, something neither of them was in any hurry to name. Tonight was special because the whole family would be together at the VIP corner table, where everything had begun 2 years ago. Phoebe walked into the bar with a 4-month pregnancy rounding her belly beneath an elegant light blue dress, her face brighter than it had ever been, amber eyes sparkling with happiness, cheeks flushed with healthy color. She wasn't the thin, sleepless girl working 3 jobs the way she had been 2 years earlier. Now she'd finished the finance degree she'd once been forced to abandon, and she was working in the legal finance division of Valencia Industries as a manager. Thorne walked beside his wife, one hand resting protectively at her back, and the other holding her hand tight, as if he feared she might vanish the moment he let go. He was still cold to the outside world, but when he looked at Phoebe, those gray eyes softened into something so warm and gentle that the people who had known him before could hardly believe what they were seeing. The scar on his shoulder from the bullet that night had healed, leaving only a faint line, a reminder of the price of love and courage. Platinum wedding bands gleamed on both their fingers. They'd been married for 1 year now, in a small ceremony with only family and the closest of friends. Thorne had gradually stepped back from the illegal side of the Valencia family, handing most of it over to Reed Sullivan while he focused on legitimate business and, more than anything, on the small family he'd built. Miles ran into the bar with a bright smile on his healthy face. 21 years old now, fully recovered after his successful heart surgery, and currently in his 3rd year at MIT with the same outstanding performance he'd always had. He hugged his sister tightly, then shook his brother-in-law's hand with real respect and gratitude, because he knew that without this man, he wouldn't be standing here. The family sat down at the VIP corner table, the same table where 2 years earlier Maggie had taken the hand of a stranger and begged him to save her daughter. The air felt warm and full of laughter as they ordered drinks and shared stories from ordinary life. Maggie looked at Thorne with emotion in her eyes and said, "You know, if I'd known that night you were a mafia boss, I never would have dared open my mouth to ask you for help. I would have been so scared I couldn't even look you in the eyes, let alone take your hand and beg." Thorne curled his mouth into a smile, a rare smile that only this family ever got to see, and he answered in a warm voice, "It's a good thing you didn't know, because if you had, I wouldn't have had the chance to meet Phoebe, and my life would still be drowned in darkness the way it used to be." Phoebe took her mother's hand and her husband's hand, her amber eyes shining with tears as she said, "Mom, you saw something in him that no one else ever saw. You looked through the cold shell, and you saw the warm heart underneath. That's why you dared to bet everything on a stranger. And you were right." Maggie wiped her tears and smiled with happiness, looking around the table where her daughter, her son-in-law, and the grandchild soon to arrive were gathered, and she knew every year of hardship and sacrifice had been repaid. Thorne looked at his new family with a gaze he never thought he could hold, the gaze of a man who had finally found peace after a lifetime of storms. He thought of his mother, of the promise he'd made long ago beside a hospital bed that he would become a good man. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, he felt he had kept that promise, in a way he never could have imagined. Because sometimes light comes to the darkest place not to be swallowed, but to guide the way, and darkness learns to love the light not by becoming brighter, but by letting the light reach the forgotten corners that have been hidden for too long. The story of Thorn and Phoebe reminds us that love can take root in the most unexpected places, that a single act of kindness, no matter how small, can change an entire life, and that we should never judge a person only by outward appearances or by what the world whispers. Maggie was only a poor janitor, but she had eyes that could see through a human soul, and those eyes saved a lost spirit drowning in the darkness of loneliness and broken trust. If you feel this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our newest videos every day. Please give us a like and share this video with the people you love, because every like and every share is a powerful source of motivation that helps us keep bringing you meaningful, moving stories. How do you feel about this story? Does it remind you of anything in your real life? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the honest feelings from deep in your heart. We always read and cherish every comment, because you are the inspiration that keeps us going on this storytelling journey. Finally, we wish every one of you watching this video strong health, a joyful and peaceful life, and a heart filled with love each day. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.